Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Theodore Roosevelt, and the focus is the expansive executive. The year is 1901, September to be exact, and Roosevelt has just taken over the presidency after the assassination of William McKinley. Roosevelt immediately says he'll keep the McKinley cabinet in place, and he'll continue to pursue McKinley's policies. After all, the American people had elected McKinley at the top of the ticket, and Roosevelt was actually fairly aligned with McKinley's policies, so this was not a big surprise. But it was also not going to be a surprise that this wasn't going to stay in place for long, in that Roosevelt was always an independent sort. He was going to do what he thought was best, and he began fairly quickly to make the presidency his own, and he was much more likely to use the power of the presidency to drive his agenda than not only William McKinley, but almost any of his predecessors. Early on, he had noted that occasionally great national crises arise which call for immediate and vigorous executive action. And in such cases, it is the duty of the president to act upon the theory that he is the steward of the people, who has the legal right to do whatever the needs of the people demand, unless the Constitution or the laws explicitly forbid him to do it. This was a very different view of the Constitution and the presidency than most of his predecessors, save for Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, who also believed in the expansive power of the executive. Most of his predecessors had frankly used the Constitution as a reason not to do things. And Roosevelt was not really inclined to follow that thought process because he saw the president and himself in that role of doing good works for the American people, and for that he needed the freedom to execute. So, let's give some examples. In 1890, about a decade before, the United States had passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. Some of these conglomerate businesses were getting so big that they were controlling entire industries, and it was counterproductive for the American people. But there had been very few lawsuits brought by the government against these large conglomerates because in general they still favored the big businessmen. Roosevelt was not quite so sure about that. And in fact, only a few months into office, he files suit against the Northern Securities Trust, which was a collection of railroads in the northwestern portion of the country. Now, J.P. Morgan, the financier from New York, was not very happy about this. He had funds invested not only in this trust, but in others. And he comes to the White House to challenge Roosevelt a little bit. And he asks Roosevelt, "Are you going to come after all my businesses?" And Roosevelt essentially responds, "No, I'm going to come after the bad ones." Because, and again, in his mind, there were good trusts and there were bad trusts. Sometimes it was hard to know what he was thinking, but when he decided something, and in this case, a bad trust, he was going to act. And in fact, he wins. This case goes to the Supreme Court. It took 2 years. It's a 5-4 decision. Northern Securities is broken up, and that paves the way for subsequent administrations to be aggressive in going after these large trusts. Another example where the expansive executive came into play was in a labor area. This time it was a labor dispute between the mine operators and the coal miners. A strike had kicked in 1902, and in the past, presidents had never waded into labor disputes. Occasionally, when they got violent and upon request from a governor, they would send troops in to try to calm the violence, but they had never gotten involved in negotiations. But Roosevelt thought, why not? And besides, this was coal. This was central to the entire American economy and the health and well-being of the American people, because coal meant heat, cold winters were coming, and he knew he had to do something to solve this problem. So he invites the union, he invites management to come to the White House, and they go across the street for a conference. And all of a sudden, Roosevelt realizes he doesn't care much for the mine operators, that they were resisting almost any entreaty, including his idea for arbitration. So what does Roosevelt do? He goes another step further. He says, you know what then? I think I will operate the mines. I have an army. And I'm going to send that army in. They'll operate the mines, and maybe that will change your tune in terms of being willing to negotiate. Now, he was questioned by everyone around him. And what authority do you have to do this? And he basically didn't care. He said, I have the authority because I am acting in the best interest of the people of the United States, and I am their president. Well, He didn't actually have to execute on this one because the mine operators got the message. They agreed to arbitration. Eventually, they settled the strike, and everyone came out looking pretty good, in particular Theodore Roosevelt, who was again convinced that this expansive use of executive power was the way to get good results. This was not only in domestic areas that he played the role of the expansive executive. Let's also talk about foreign relations. Now, Roosevelt was like one of many U.S. presidents who for decades had desired to have a canal go through Central America to connect the East and the West, the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, both for personal travel, for economic reasons, and military reasons. This was a high desire for American presidents for years. There were also many boundaries and barriers to this, including treaties. The French had tried to build such a canal in Panama in the 1880s. It was a disaster. They ran out of money. Thousands of people died from yellow fever. And so Roosevelt says, though, time is now right, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do it the right way. So he has his Secretary of State, John Hay, negotiate a treaty with Colombia, because Panama was part of Colombia at the time, and Colombia agrees to the treaty. The Americans would build the canal, but then the Colombian Senate balks. They reject the treaty, and Roosevelt is not happy because he still thinks Panama is the best route, although some are advocating for Nicaragua. He wants Panama. So he gets a visit from a gentleman by the name of Philippe Bunau-Varilla. Now, Bunau-Varilla had been involved in the previous attempt that the French had to build the canal, and he was still had some money invested and relationships in Panama to get this thing done. So he was inclined to get Roosevelt to continue to commit to the Panama route. He joins Roosevelt at the White House and he gives a suggestion. His suggestion is a revolution. What if the Panamanians declared independence and then you can negotiate directly with them? Well, Roosevelt doesn't commit on the spot to anything, but he makes the following statement. He, Bunau-Varilla, he had no assurances in any way or from anyone authorized to speak for us. At the same time, he is a very able fellow, and it was his business to find out what he thought our government would do. I have no doubt that he was able to make a very accurate guess and to advise his people accordingly. In fact, he would have been a very dull man had he been unable to make such guess. Well, with a wink and a nod, Theodore Roosevelt approved of this Declaration of Independence by Panama, and just to sew things up together, he sent a U.S. battleship into Colombian waters so that when the Panamanians declared independence and Colombia was about to send troops to quell what they considered a rebellion, they saw the American battleship looming and they backed off. The revolution was complete without a shot being fired. The Americans were the first to recognize Panama as an independent country. They got a treaty, and within a few months, they're building a canal. Now, Roosevelt, again, was criticized from all over the place for fomenting a revolution. He, of course, denied the whole thing. He said, look, I didn't give any assurances. They did this on their own. Besides, we got a great outcome, so what difference does it make? This was, again, sort of the end justifies the means part of Theodore Roosevelt, that as long as he got the good outcome, he'd use his power any way he saw fit. And this was, again, a different mode from most U.S. presidents of the past. So another example, and this goes back to the start of the Republic, is, again, who has the authority to send the U.S. military into operations? The Constitution gives that authority to declare war in the hands of Congress. And there had always been this feeling that only with congressional authority could American presidents send troops into a foreign area. Roosevelt felt differently. And this came to test in Cuba in 1906. Now, Cuba is an independent nation, thanks to the U.S. and its recent war with Spain, but the U.S. also has a very strong presence still in Cuba, and they're monitoring closely, and if things aren't going well, which was happening in 1906, the U.S. had the authority to intervene. What Roosevelt didn't have the authority to do was to send troops, in that there was no declaration of war underway. But Roosevelt said, I'm not going to declare war, I'm going to support the peace. And with that, he believed he could send troops, frankly, anywhere he wanted. He made the note, in fact, to his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, if it becomes necessary to intervene, I intend to establish a precedent for good by refusing to wait for a long wrangle with Congress. The important thing to do is for a president who is willing to accept responsibility to establish precedents, which successors may follow even if they are unwilling to take the initiative themselves. So that's what Roosevelt did time and time again. He used that expansive power of the executive to set new precedents. And it's one of the main reasons why the 20th century set of precedents tended to have a much more aggressive and expansive view of the executive than most in the 19th century, and a lot of that was due to Theodore Roosevelt. Now, there was one person who actually said an interesting quote about this all at the same time. The quote was, "The president's tendency to make the executive power stronger than the houses of Congress is bound to be a bad thing, especially when a man of weaker personality succeeds him in office." You know who said that? His distant cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, who was a huge admirer of Theodore and almost really wanted to be like him, but he saw at the time this could be dangerous. Now, of course, when Franklin Roosevelt becomes president 3 decades later, he fully embraces the idea, and in fact, by then, it has become the new pattern of the expansive executive of the United States of America. That is Theodore Roosevelt and the expansive executive from the life of Theodore Roosevelt. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.